Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Makiza Latifa and I'm happy to be coming your way with this week's episode of the show, which promises to be as educative as always. You know that there's so much going on in various parts of the world, but the purpose of this show is to bring China closer to you. We'll start with China currents with Kris, and one of the most topical stories for this segment is certainly the arrival of the Arabic and Islamic foreign ministers into the country as part of a tour which aims at ending the war in Gaza. There will also be a bit about what Chinese President Xi Jinping had to say about the Israeli occupation of Palestine during the BRICS Leaders Video Summit. These and many more are contained in today's edition of China Currents, so let's get straight into it.
China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started. Hi, welcome to China Currents. I'm Kris. The top news of this week is definitely the arrival of the Arabic and Islamic foreign ministers. From November 20th to 21st, a delegation of foreign ministers from Arab and Islam countries visited China as their first stop of a tour aiming at ending the war in Gaza. Members of the delegation include Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud, Jordanian Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi, Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shukri, Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi, Palestinian Foreign Minister Riyad al-Maliki, and Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Hissam Brahim Taha. China vows to have in-depth communication and coordination with the delegation on ways to de-escalate the ongoing Palestine-Israel conflict, protect civilians and seek a just settlement of the Palestinian question. Some believe that the delegation chose to go to China in the hope that China would act as a superpower to pressure Israel to call for a ceasefire, especially after China mediated Saudi-Iran deal. However, some Chinese want China to remain calm. China has done all it could in this conflict, including calls for a ceasefire in the international community, providing supply and humanitarian aids. The key to a ceasefire in the Gaza war still depends on the attitude of the United States. That is not the only effort China did to promote peace in Palestine. On November 21st, the leaders of the BRICS nations held a video meeting to address the escalating war in Gaza. Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, and the United Arab Emirates, nations that were invited to join the BRICS next year, also attended the meeting. The virtual conference is the first of its kind dedicated to an international issue in the history of BRICS. A joint statement was released calling for the release of hostage and a humanitarian truce. The statement was signed on by the UN Secretary General's office. Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a speech during the BRICS Leaders Video Summit, in which he expressed his view on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and urged for immediate action to achieve a lasting and secure peace. He highlighted three urgent tasks that need to be addressed. Firstly, he called for an immediate cessation of hostilities, urging the conflicting parties to stop violence and attacks against civilians and release hostages. Secondly, Xi emphasized the importance of secure humanitarian corridors and increased assistance to the people in Gaza. Lastly, Xi expressed the need for practical measures by the international community to prevent the conflict from destabilizing the entire Middle East region. The BRICS video conference on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict represents a significant milestone in international diplomacy, showcasing the unity and determination of emerging market countries and developing nations to address global challenges. By leveraging the collective influence, the BRICS countries are striving to bring about a peaceful resolution of the ongoing conflict and foster a more just and harmonious world. As of November 22nd, a deal was reached between the two conflicting parties to release hostages from both sides. Next up, let's turn to sports. On November 21st, South Korea beat China 3-0 in the Group C of the 2026 FIFA World Cup Asian Zone qualifying tournament. China's defeat to South Korea was not unexpected, given the apparent disparity in the team's strengths. However, controversy ensued as Korean top star Song Hyo-min's action on the field sparked a heated debate. After scoring a goal, the Tottenham captain made a gesture to silence the Chinese fans, which didn't sit well with the Chinese players. Speaking in a post-match interview, Son acknowledged the challenging nature of playing away from home and expressed his appreciation for the enthusiastic Chinese fans. The match also had its share of refereeing controversies, with Chinese players questioning the first penalty awarded to Korea. This is South Korea's second consecutive victory, placing them at the top of the group standing. And despite the loss, China is still in the race to qualify for the World Cup, as it had won 2-1 against Thailand earlier this month. With upcoming matches against Singapore in March next year, the Chinese team aims to secure all 6 points and continue its progress. Next up, international cooperation. On November 20th, Chinese President Xi Jinping had a phone call with the French President Emmanuel Macron. President Xi praised France's active participation in the Belt and Road Initiative Summit and the China International Import Expo, seeking to strengthen economic ties between the two countries. It's worth noting that during the phone call, President Xi expressed the expectation that France would provide a fair and non-discriminatory business environment for Chinese enterprises investing in France. Months prior, the EU Commission launched an anti-subsidy investigation against Chinese electric vehicle companies, which could potentially face high tariffs when entering the European market. Paris was considered a key player in pushing the EU authority to initiate that probe. As electric vehicles become symbolic of both environmental issues and a potential China-EU trade conflict, the heads of state emphasized efforts to mitigate the situation during their conversation. Both sides stressed their track record of cooperation in responding to climate change and agreed to continue their joint efforts in the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference in Dubai. Additionally, according to multiple media outlets, French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna is set to visit China this week, shortly after the phone call between the two presidents. Next up, on November 20th, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning expressed deep concern about the US decision to sell up to 400 long-range Tomahawk missiles to Japan during a press briefing. The arms trade was authorized by US State Department on November 17th with a total transaction value of approximately $2.35 billion. Although the US didn't mention China directly, they claimed that the arms sale would improve Japan's capacity to meet current and future threats. Initially, the delivery of the missiles was scheduled to begin in 2026, but the US and Japan agreed to accelerate the timeline by 1 year by replacing a portion of the missiles with older types. On the same day the US authorized the deal, Chinese President Xi and US President Biden agreed to reopen military-to-military contact during their meeting in San Francisco. And consequently, arms trade is seen as US taking military advantage while pretending to have a détente with China. Chinese spokesperson Mao Ning criticized the US attempt to arm Japan, a country restrained by its peace constitution. The Tomahawk deal will further intensify an arms race that undermines regional peace and security. Mao also pointed out that Japan's history of waging World War II has made its militarization a concern for neighboring countries. Mao concluded by stating that US and Japan should respect the security concerns of Asian countries. Next up, on November 23rd, a ceremony in Incheon was jointly held by China and South Korea to transfer the remains and belongings of 25 Chinese soldiers who sacrificed their lives during the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. The significant event marked the 10th handover ceremony and took place at Incheon International Airport. Chinese ambassador to South Korea Xing Haiming respectfully covered the coffins of the soldiers with Chinese national flags, followed by a solemn memorial service conducted by the Chinese delegation. The coffins were then escorted by the Chinese honor guards to an awaiting Air Force plane for repatriation. Expressing gratitude for South Korea's consistent effort in facilitating the handover, Chinese Vice Minister of Veterans Affairs Chang Zhengguo acknowledged and appreciated their commitment. Chang also emphasized China's dedication to further enhancing communication and coordination with South Korea, deepening friendly cooperation, and expediting repatriation process for more fallen Chinese soldiers. The ceremony was attended by members of the Chinese delegation, officials from the Chinese embassy in South Korea, representatives of the Chinese students and companies based in South Korea, as well as officials from South Korean Defense Ministry, Foreign Ministry, and Presidential Office. Next up, let's take a look at Tesla in China. On November 20th, according to the salesperson in Tesla China, the price of Model 3 and Model Y is set to increase this week due to rising costs. According to the salesperson, this price increase is expected to be consecutive and will apply to all models in the Tesla lineup. The salesperson also revealed that due to strong sales, there is significant pressure on the production line, resulting in higher production costs. As a result, the prices of the relevant Tesla models are expected to continue to rise this week. Currently, a Tesla Model 3 costs 261,400 yuan in China, while the Model 3 in US costs about $28,490. Tesla sold more than 25,000 vehicles in October. In comparison, BYD, China's largest EV manufacturer, sold more than 246,000 vehicles in October. Tesla's increase in price was not the only thing that put them in this week's trending news. A Chinese woman identified as Li has been instructed by the court to issue a public apology to Tesla and provide compensation after being found guilty of defamation. The case stems from an incident in March 2021 when Li was involved in a traffic accident when driving Tesla Model 3. In a subsequent turn of events, Li, along with another woman named Zhang, staged a protest at the Shanghai Auto Expo in April. Both donned attire bearing the words "brake failure" in an attempt to discredit Tesla. Zhang was subsequently detained for disruption of public order, while Li received an administrative warning. The court's judgment mandates Li to remove all defamatory statements and comments regarding Tesla from her social media account within 10 days. Additionally, she is required to issue a written apology to Tesla via same platform. As part of the ruling, Li must compensate Tesla for the economic losses and legal expenses totaling 2,000 yuan. Furthermore, Li is responsible for covering the appraisal fee of 20,000 yuan. The court allocated a majority of the court acceptance fee, 25,000 yuan, to the plaintiff, with Li being accountable for a nominal portion. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts and comments about our show, please reach us at the email address below. I'm Kris, looking forward to hearing from you, and see you next time.
Well, thank you very kindly for the updates, Kris. We are always excited to see and hear about what's happening in China. But at this point, let's head straight into the Thinkers Forum for insights from our scholars for the day who have vast knowledge about the topics tailored for today's discussion. We'll start with Diane Sare, who is a 2024 independent candidate for the U.S. Senate from the state of New York. And she'll be speaking about the U.S. general elections, which will be held next year.
I'm Diane Sare. I'm an independent candidate for U.S. Senate from the state of New York in the United States, and that means my election is in November of 2024. And I think what is important for everyone to know, it is the case that these upcoming elections are among the most important elections ever in American history and even in world history, because we are on the brink of a catastrophic war, even possibly world war. And unfortunately, the current administration of the United States seems to be oblivious to the results of its policies. So in the presidential election, we have three major candidates. We have Joe Biden, the incumbent president, who is very old, who doesn't seem to know where he is a lot of the time, who clearly is being advised by other people. We have Donald Trump, the former president, who is under a vicious political attack. I'm not endorsing him or any candidate myself right now, but I would say that to have a presidential candidate facing 91 criminal indictments indicate that there is a certain political nature to the targeting of this individual, and even the threat that he could be in prison by the time of the elections, which is serving to cause the American people to become very angry and to support him more than ever. So I think what we're seeing in the United States, especially with what they're doing to Donald Trump now, is that Americans actually are very interested. If someone is getting what they consider bad press, then the American people say, oh, that person must be doing something interesting. I'm going to look at what they're doing. And then you have Robert Kennedy Jr., the nephew of our assassinated President John F. Kennedy, the son of Robert Kennedy, who probably would have been president had he not also been assassinated. Robert Kennedy Jr. has just left the Democratic Party to announce that he will run as an independent. Now, why has Robert Kennedy Jr. left the Democratic Party? Well, what many people may not understand is that the so-called Democratic Party is not terribly democratic. And the Democratic National Committee made a policy that they have decided that Joe Biden will be their candidate no matter what happens in the primary. So Robert Kennedy Jr. said, well, what is the point of people voting for me if their vote is going to count for Joe Biden? He fought for a while. He tried to fight the Democratic Party, tried to get them to change their rules. They would not. So he left the party to run as an independent. And there were polls showing that 63% of American voters supported him running independent. So there is a great recognition in the United States right now that the bureaucracy of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party no longer represents the view of the average American voter. The state rule in New York was, in the past, if you want to get your name on the ballot, you have 6 weeks in which to collect 15,000 valid signatures. Now, if you are an independent candidate, if you are not with the two major parties, you have to collect 45,000 valid signatures in 6 weeks. I ran for U.S. Senate against the incumbent Chuck Schumer in 2022, and I became the first and only person in the state of New York to actually succeed at getting on the ballot. I was the only one. I turned in 66,000 signatures, and I can say in the last election, I also learned something about election fraud in the United States because I watched on television my vote go from 57,000 election night, which was already lower than it should have been, but that's another story, but to 29,000 the next morning, and by the end of the week it was 25,000. And I can tell you there's a group in New York that's monitoring the elections. They discovered that according to the state public records, in the 2020 election, the one that Donald Trump said was fraudulent, in the state of New York, there were 300,000 more votes certified by the Secretary of State than voters who voted in the election. At least a 4% margin of votes that you can play with to change the outcome of an election. And this was done across the board, I think, in many, many states. I think there is legitimate reason to say there is fraud. I think this is a real problem in a democratic republic because the voters must have confidence that their voice is being heard. If the voters feel that they don't know that they are being heard, that they don't know that their vote counts, then you get a very dangerous situation. Demoralization, frustration, maybe at some point even violence. It's very bad. So this is one problem the United States has to correct, is to create our election system in such a way that it's verifiable and the American voters have confidence in the outcome. It is very different than the hypocritical position of the United States government right now that we are the #1 democracy. As you heard from the Democratic Party policy, we're not that democratic. As a candidate for U.S. Senate in New York, what I am hoping to do is to rally the American voters to a policy not only anti-war, but a policy of economic cooperation, economic development. And personally, I am actually very excited by the role that China is playing in the world right now, the effort to alleviate poverty, to work with other nations without making arbitrary demands on what they must do before they can get economic aid. And personally, I think the expansion of the BRICS is very exciting. I think it can help very much stabilize the world. One of the biggest debates right now is about migration. Thanks to Biden, a really uncontrolled policy at the border. I went to New York City. It's a terrible crisis because the city has brought in 1 year 110,000 migrants. So imagine a city where 1 out of 10 public school children is already homeless, and you bring in 110,000 more people who are homeless, who have to be sheltered, and you have an economy which is collapsing and there is no place for people to go. This is a situation that has many Americans very upset, and that gets at the other issue, which is the economy. We have a lot of inflation still in the United States, and thanks to our genius anti-inflationary policy of raising interest rates, no one can afford to get a loan. I have a friend who was in an accident. She needs to find a new car. The interest rate on an auto loan is 10%. So you can't buy a new car. And a used car today costs more than a new car did 3 years ago. You look at the US economy, we have this gigantic bubble. Our production has completely collapsed. We're sending $100 billion in weapons to Ukraine, to Israel, and God knows what else. Meanwhile, we have people drowning in floods. Our farmers are suffering. Our schools are falling apart. We don't have health care. We have a disaster at home. And we have the possibility actually of collaborating with the Belt and Road. We are trying to set up a competition in a way which is a fraud because we have no intention of building anything. So that's number two. And then number three, the issue of war. That people are very worried. They maybe don't know how to express it. You're seeing Americans in the street now more because they're upset about that Israel is trying to do ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian population in Gaza. So more people are in the streets, but I think there is actually a very deep fear about nuclear war between the US and Russia. Well, a lot of Americans use the phrase deep state to discuss kind of dirty operations, like how do we have a war with Iraq when everyone knows there's no weapons of mass destruction? Why are people who are actually guilty of major crimes not going to jail, like not one single major Wall Street banker has gone to jail since 2008? I'll just say that to anyone out there who thinks you can trust the United States. You can't trust us. Not right now. Not until we make some changes.
And next on the Thinkers Forum is Jean Oberg, a political science academic, a peace researcher and the director of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research, whose submission on this edition of the Thinkers Forum will touch on creating a multipolar, peaceful and cooperative world.
I'm a PhD in sociology from way back in time at Lund University in South Sweden. So I'm a social scientist, and I've specialized all my academic life on peace studies. That is a branch of social studies where we deal with reducing violence exactly as a doctor reduces diseases if he or she can, and then disseminating this through research, public outreach, and activities on the ground. I worked in a lot of war zones and tried to heal wounds after wars. It's always very difficult to find the reality beneath those types of personal meetings. My quick reading on CNN and BBC and others of what happened yesterday was a benevolent Chinese president who emphasized cooperation, who emphasized that we must solve humanity's problems together, etc. And a Biden who, if he's clear in his brain for some short period, tries to say the same, but then immediately after he gets a question at the press conference, do you still think that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, would you still call him a dictator? Well, I think his formulation is, I spent more than 60 hours with the Chinese president, and yes, I would. And the answer is why? And the question is from Biden, because he runs a communist country that is different from ours. Now, if that's your attitude, if that's your intellectual level, that somebody who runs a country according to different principles is by definition a dictator. I mean, if you think somebody is a dictator, you will treat that person and his country in a different way from if you think he's just a different kind of leader from us, but he's okay. The United States of America and much of the Christian world cannot live without somebody who is different, threatening, non-believers, don't do what we tell them to do, and who do not accept mission. So I believe that that has been sped up, let's say, since the last 5 to 10 years. If I give you an example, I think it's now 5 years ago, that the Congress passed a law, and listen carefully, a law which set off $1,500 million, $1.5 billion, over 5 years to train Western journalists in writing negative stories about China. That's done by the state agency of media in the United States. Now, those of us who go to China, or Westerners who live here and see the complexities and the broadness and try to understand China on Chinese premises, see it differently. But that is where they are. They need desperately to have enemies. And if you don't have enemies, and I don't see anything in China's foreign policy that is a threat to the United States. It is not China that has its vessels outside California's coast or Florida's coast. It is the West that has all its vessels around China. And the AUKUS cooperation with Australia, and the submarines that are there, and the Germans who are in your waters, the international waters around you too, and the Taiwan issue. I don't see China do these things to the West. Imagine, it's not completely comparable, but imagine that China was obsessed with arming Hawaii to become an independent state. I wonder how Washington would react to something like that. And therefore you invent your enemies. If you want enemies, it's easy to make it. You now have Russia, you have a large part of the African world, the global south, and you have China, that you declare don't follow us, are different from us, think differently, and therefore they are our enemies. This is very, very dangerous and very, very sad, because we could gain so much from working together. And I can still only hope that there will be somebody who comes to their senses, and it will not be Biden, and it will not be Trump, and change America from the inside. Because the moment America, with all its resources, creativity and ideas and history and knowledge, begin to become a partner in the world, not somebody who insists on dominating over everybody else, the world will be a much better place, and the United States will be a much better place. So I'm looking for a peaceful revolution where the Americans will rise and say, enough is enough with your empire and militarism. We want a good society here, and we want to be friends with the world. The only candidate who is saying that at the moment is Robert Kennedy Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. But it remains to be seen whether he will have a chance to become a president. I doubt it, but we'll see. Well, if you look at what I would call the social cosmology of the West, it's very much made up of center-periphery, one God, one truth, either or thinking, male or female, left or right, not both and it is handicapped by being a culture of mission or missionary. You have the French word civilisation, mission civilisatrice. The idea that we are supposed as number one world, you remember it was one called the first world, the second world, the third world, and the fourth world, that by the first one there's this idea that we shall all move up to become like the West, Europe and the United States. And that idea, of course, is everywhere, whether in colonialist times in Africa or elsewhere, the liberation movements in the 60s, they said, we don't want to have your system, whether it's Christianity or it's your way of thinking of human rights or whatever. And you have the same question here in China with the opening up of Nixon and Chu Enlai's meeting via the connection of Chas Freeman and Kissinger, that the hope was that if we open up to China, we will achieve two things. One, we will see to it that China and Russia will not be ganging up against us. We'll split you. And secondly, we hope China will go our way, become a multi-party system with a capitalist economy and be like us. This be like us is over. This be like us or become like us is over. And that's what the Americans cannot understand. They still believe that they have to lead, that the world must be led by the Americans. And the reason they can't see it and they are in denial is that it's going down. Not the US as a state or a society, but as an empire. And all empires go down. There's no empire that has existed forever. So you may say the United States today is Titanic. The West is sitting as restaurants in Titanic, and the water is coming up around the windows. Now, instead of then reaching out and say, okay, our time is over, we will be one among many and we will cooperate with you, what they do is they insist on one thing, and that is to dominate by means of deception, untruths, narratives, and secondly, militarism. I would like to predict at this occasion, the United States will go the same way as the Soviet Union because it is militarizing itself to death. The Americans don't do diplomacy anymore, they send weapons. They pour in weapons because that's what they are best at. But no country can survive with just being strong in one sense, for instance militarily. If you become politically weak, you become economically weak, you become psychologically weak, you become weak in terms of international law and legitimacy, then you are on your way down. A strong country is one which has high level on all power indicators and do not over-militarize and neglect the other power scales. The United States has, you can say, a MIMAC. MIMAC, Military Industrial Media Academic Complex. These are elites who have common interests with each other, such as producing weapons, selling weapons, using weapons, destroying countries, rebuilding countries again. But they do not have any common interest with the people in their countries. They're outside democratic control, and who said that? President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1961 or 2 or whenever he made his farewell speech. It's a very famous speech by a man who was a general himself. Who said the United States has developed a military industrial complex? He didn't call it MIMAC as I do. And we need to put it under control to remain a democracy. What is undermined very, very clearly now is pluralist open media and our democracy in the West, because everything is now geared to warfare and militarism. More, more, more. There's nobody who stops to think. There's nobody who stops to think about the long-term consequences of pouring in weapons and never solving the conflicts. You just look at what goes on now in Israel. The country that has so much weaponry already, had nuclear weapons, have had a special agreement with weapons with the United States, $5 billion a year, I don't know for how many years. What is the first reaction in Washington? We must transfer even more weapons to Israel. This is a sick society. It's a sick way of thinking. And of course, this whole thing has to do with, as I said before, the dream, the unrealistic dream or illusion that if we can get rid of Russia as an opponent, and we have created that opponent ourselves because they have never invaded a NATO country, they hope that they can concentrate all NATO's resources on a Cold War or, God forbid, a hot war against China. You just go to NATO's homepage and you look at the threat perception. NATO is now characterized to be something like a church. You either believe in this nonsense or you don't. There's never an argument on NATO's homepage. The text is, China is a threat or a challenge because China is different from us. China has different interests from us in the West. Now, if that's how you define a threat, everybody around the world basically is a threat. So the whole thing is a military-industrial complex lives from finding enemies, because if you don't have enemies, or say you have enemies, or appoint somebody, or make enemies, you can't legitimate your own arms development, and the military-industrial media academic complex will fall apart. So that's why the moment we get rid of that military-industrial media academic complex, we can begin to talk to each other as human beings. So the long story short here, I think, is that I wouldn't trust that the Americans are going to change much unless there is a people's revolution, a non-violent, not the stupid thing that we saw on 6th of January 2 years ago. But if there is an uprising in the United States saying, no more militarism, we want a good society here, we want cooperation with China and everybody else in the world. We need to cooperate to solve humanity's environmental problems, poverty problems, infrastructure problems, all these things. We're wasting every hour for humanity's and our children's future by militarism and warfare. Now, I know that China is the second largest military power on earth and it has nuclear weapons. I have a problem with that, but that's my problem. But the long story short is that China wants cooperation. It wants the Belt and Road Initiative. It wants a good relationship with the US. It maybe do things we don't like in the West, but it's not a reason to have a Cold War against it. It's a reason to talk with it. So therefore, these meetings are important, but we need much more dialogue in terms of online thinking. We need NGOs working together. We need cultural people working together. In parentheses, I'm also an art photographer and I'm trying to do an exhibition here in China about dialogue. And those types of things that can soften the hardliners, undermine the hardliners who want sooner or later a war. And if you ask me, Taiwan, it's very simple. It's China. It's China, and it's very clear in the communique between Chu Enlai and Nixon. I think it's number 12. It's a very large document. It's very clearly saying the United States will not interfere in this issue. And so we have a one China policy. It does all the things it shouldn't do in Taiwan. And I have a huge problem with that. I'm not very popular saying that in the West. But if we keep on doing this, we can only hope that China will be patient enough for long enough for the United States to sink on its own in that destructive self-militarization. But I would wish, as somebody who has never hated the US and never been anti-US, or anti-American as they say, I'm a collector of American art, I work with American scholars every day, that the United States will come to its senses and begin to see itself as one partner of the world and not a dominator, an imperialist and militarist. I think it's possible. We still have this possibility of rising from below in the Western world and say enough is enough. I'm looking for democracy to work that way. I'm not looking for Biden or Trump. I don't think they will change the system. We need a system change in the West. Well, there can't be peace in the world without the two biggest countries and economies working together. Again, I would have hoped that the European Union would be helpful. The European Union could have been a mediator in a way between Americans' hardline anti-China policies and China. But with von der Leyen obviously being more or less, a propagator of Washington, having no independent mind or thinking of the European Union, and with Mr. Borrell, who's basically a racist, remember his statement about the paradise in Europe and the jungle outside that is dangerous, there's not much hope there either. I was a believer in the European Union because I thought it could be another West with a more intelligent dialogue policies, East, West, North and South, than the empire over there were in Washington was, but I was wrong. So I'm not very optimistic on the short run. In the long run, I'm optimistic because the day the US empire has fallen, NATO will fall apart. There's no NATO without the US leadership and militarism. And that's a moment when we can create a multipolar, peaceful, cooperative world. I hope I live long enough to see that materialize.
And that's all we have for you on this edition of the show. I want to say thank you for spending your morning with us here on China Now. We appreciate your company. Remember to send in your comments, thoughts, feedback, and suggestions through the email provided below. My name is Makiza Latifa, and I'll see you same time next week.